Good afternoon, everyone, and a very warm welcome to everyone who is joining us over YouTube or Facebook. Today, we are here to listen to a very interesting talk on the rise of the English history play in the age of Shakespeare. The lecture will be delivered by a very eminent scholar and academician, Dr. Subhajit Sen Gupta. Dr. Subhajit Sen Gupta began his career in the academia in 1999 and is presently Associate Professor and Head in the Department of English and Culture Studies, the University of Burdwan. He is passionate about Shakespeare and the European Renaissance, and his doctoral thesis, for which he received his PhD degree in 2006, was entitled Genre and Meaning in Shakespeare's Histories. He is member of the Shakespeare Society of India and has earlier been member of the British Shakespeare Association. His other interests include 18th century British literature and culture, adaptation studies, and postmodern literature and culture. Besides this, Dr. Sengupta is known among his peers for his interest in variegated walks of life. He is passionate about poetry and is very well known for his very dramatic and, let's say, articulate recitation of lines from Shakespeare, both from his plays and his sonnets. He is a man of theater, had been an actor, and he also does a bit of acting still. He has an avid interest in sports. In fact, he had been a sports journalist for a leading daily for a few times. He is an extraordinary painter and has a keen eye for catching wildlife through photography. So here's to someone whom we may call a myriad-minded man, Dr. Subhajit Sen Gupta, to speak on the rise of the English history play in the age of Shakespeare. Before I formally begin, or before I formally invite Dr. Sen Gupta to begin his lecture, I would request everyone who is listening in to, if you have any question, to put those questions in the chat box or the comment box of YouTube. And after the lecture is over, Dr. Sengupta will be answering those. So here is to Dr. Subhajit Sengupta to speak on the rise of English history play. Subhajit. You are on the mute. Your microphone is on the mute. Subhajit.
Oh, is
Yeah.
it so? All right, I'll just
Yeah.
check.
Okay. You are on the mute. Your microphone is on the mute.
No, it's not muted. It's not muted. Shoykot, it's not muted.
Yeah, now you are clearly audible. Well, just mute
All
for a
right.
while. Anyways, please go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. Just one moment. All right. A very warm good evening, everyone who is listening to this on YouTube. And I feel privileged and honored to have been invited to speak as part of this wonderful series of webinar lectures being organized by Midnapur College. My association with Midnapur town goes back a long way, and I have been, for a variety of reasons, associated with Midnapur since the start of this century. And I had worked in Vidyasagar University for a couple of years before shifting to my present workplace. So I have a soft spot for Midnapur, and when this invitation came along, I was only too willing to accept. And I thank the organizers once again for having given me this opportunity to speak today on the rise of the English history play in the age of Shakespeare. Now, although that is the title of my presentation, I will be focusing not so much on the rise of the history play in England in the age of Shakespeare as on what was understood in the age of Shakespeare by the history play. And I'll look at a few definitions of the history play which were offered in the 20th century before finally arriving at a series of conclusions. Now, the writing of history in early modern England, by which we mean Renaissance England, drew upon two distinct traditions. On the one hand, we have the humanist historiographers of Italy, and on the other hand, we have the Christian historiographers. So these were the two strains of the writing of history during the Renaissance: the humanist historiography and the Christian historiography. The Italian humanist historians wrote what was essentially secular history. And they wrote that kind of history for a variety of reasons. First of all, the writing of history was a fashionable literary activity, and there was therefore an artistic and literary reason for writing history. Secondly, history, it was believed, taught certain important lessons related to ethics, morals, and politics. Now, this was a didactic reason for writing history, while the first had been an artistic and literary reason for writing history. And there was also a political reason for writing history, because history celebrated the past and the present glories of a country. In 2006, there was a book called The Renaissance in Historical Thought, written by Wallace Ferguson, where Ferguson argued that these three reasons were the most important for an Italian humanist historian to have for the writing of history. Now, most Elizabethan historians in England, including writers of history plays such as Shakespeare, wrote on historical subjects for the same reasons. Among the Italian humanist historians were people such as Petrarch and Boccaccio and Leonardo Bruni, Poggio Bracciolini, sometimes pronounced Bracciolini, and there was Tito Livio and Polydore Virgil. And all these writers of history, humanist historians from Italy, exerted a considerable influence on English writers of history and on the English perception of history, the English understanding of history, what history was, and how history had to be written and recorded for posterity. Petrarch, Boccaccio, and Bruni, the early Italian humanist historians, wrote national history, while the later Italian humanist historians were drawn more towards contemporary political events. Now, English historiography of the later Elizabethan period, the 1570s, and down to the early years of the 17th century, that is to say, up till the death of Elizabeth in 1603, English historiography of the Elizabethan period, the later Elizabethan period particularly, and also the early years of writing history in England. Now, historiography of the Elizabethan period was also subject to the influence of the later Florentine school of history, which was represented by Machiavelli and Guicciardini, among several others. Renaissance historiography in 16th century England was also fashioned and shaped by what we may call the religious, the Christian, the theological philosophy of history or understanding of history. And although chroniclers like Hall and Holinshed learned much from the Italian secular humanist historiography, their indebtedness to the Christian historiography is also quite evident, as we find a number of instances and a number of points in their works where we have bits and patches of religious ideas thrown in. The writings of the Tudor historians in early modern England, and Hall and Holinshed were Tudor historians. The Tudor period began in 1485 with the rise to the throne of Henry VII, who was the grandfather of Elizabeth I. And the writings of the Tudor historians in early modern England was characterized also by political partisanship, which was largely favorable to the Tudor dynasty, and sought to justify the coming to power of the Tudors. Tudor historians such as Hall invoked Christian historiography, and this is how Christian historiography was brought into use for political purposes. So the distinction is not as wide as is likely to be supposed between Christian historiography and secular humanist historiography. Tudor historians invoked Christian historiography in order to show the purposes of the Tudors as essentially being the purposes of God himself. And so the idea was to suggest through Christian historiography that the coming to power of the Tudor dynasty was the wish and the handiwork of God. The medieval current of the Christian philosophy of history interprets the culmination of the Wars of the Roses in 1485 with the overthrow of the Plantagenets and the accession of Henry VII, Queen Elizabeth's grandfather, as a divinely ordained scheme of events. The Wars of the Roses was fought between 1455 and 1485, and it was a series of civil wars fought between the two branches of the House of Plantagenet, the House of Lancaster, whose members wore red roses as emblems, and the House of York, whose members wore white roses. E.M.W. Tilliard, in a book called Shakespeare's History Plays, sets into motion what has since then come to be called the Tilliardian school of thought. And the Tilliardian school of thought had taken Shakespeare's history plays to be subscribing to the theory that Christian historiography was employed to show the purposes of the Tudors and the coming to power of the Tudors as being divinely ordained, or being a kind of fulfillment, materialization of divine wish. Now, but this view of Shakespeare's histories is rather old, and Tilliard now is a favorite punching bag of modern critics of the history plays. And his views have outlived their utility, possibly, and have been considerably reassessed and qualified by modern interpreters of the history plays, such as Graham Holderness and Phyllis Rackham and Pugliotti. Holderness, for instance, says, unlike other genres, such as comedy and tragedy, which have their origins in religious ritual, that of Chronicle produces a dramatic fiction directly based in the secularized representation of supposed historical fact. So what Holderness is suggesting is that religion or Christianity have nothing whatsoever to do with the writing of the history plays in England. Now, of course, this is debatable, but there is considerable sense in Holderness's insistence on the history plays being secularized representations of supposed historical fact. Now, so far as Chronicle plays go, they were possibly an early and rather immature version of the later history plays. Sometimes the two genres are spoken about interchangeably as if they were the same, but it's and desirable that we draw a line of distinction between the Chronicle plays and the history plays, and think of runners of the history plays. And what were the Chronicle plays? They were rather simplistic and sometimes crude dramatization of historical events. And early English Chronicle plays include the famous victories of Henry V, which was an anonymous play. There was The Life and Death of Jack Straw, which was by George Peele. The Troublesome Reign of King John of England, which again probably was by George Peele. We are not absolutely sure. And there was The True Tragedy of Richard III, which is an anonymous play. And there were, of course, several others, but these were some of the well-known English chronicle plays written around the time of Shakespeare, and some of them before Shakespeare. The genre evolved, as I was saying, into the mature history play with Christopher Marlowe's Edward II and Shakespeare's 10 plays on English history, including the 8 plays in the 2 tetralogies. We'll talk about the tetralogies. Now, the history play, as a kind of evolved and more developed version, a more mature version of the chronicle play, did not simply dramatize events from history, but also set the events of history within the framework of ideology. That is very, very important. The history plays, for example, point to the past as a lesson for the present. So there is this sort of moral undertone to the history plays. And secondly, the history plays assume the presence of a national patriotic consciousness in their audience. Now, patriotism had much to do with the rise of the English history play. And the history play, if we think of it as an independent genre of drama, and there are debates on that even today, but I personally would subscribe to the view that it is an independent genre of drama. But it is, as I will point out, the most English of all the dramatic genres, and it had its origin in England during the Renaissance, during the 1580s to be more precise. And the English history play flourished in times of intense patriotic fervor and zeal, and it flourished between the 1580s and the 1630s. And the rise of the English history play followed the victory by the English naval fleet over the invading Spanish naval fleet called the Armada in 1588. By the 1630s, however, shortly before the theatres were closed down by the Puritans in 1642, the English history play was out of fashion. And I'm quoting these 3 words from the prologue of John Ford's play Perkin Warbeck, which was written in 1634. That's a mistake on the slide, 1634, which itself was a history play from the Caroline period. And the prologue says that the English history play was going out of fashion. So that's indeed what was happening to this kind of drama in the 1630s. Now, the Elizabethan history play emerged in a way out of the morality play. In the morality play, didacticism and symbolism were designed not to so much talk about facts and action and incidents as to communicate ideas, moral ideas. The morality plays contained elements that could facilitate the dramatization of history and at the same time serve the didactic ends of Tudor historiography, the moral ends of Tudor historiography. The plot formula of the morality play, you know what that is, could conveniently be connected to events in history to create complete plays and meaningful plays which would serve, as I was saying, the moral and didactic ends of Tudor historiography. Now, in the Elizabethan history play, the polemics of religion, foregrounded in the moralities, are applied to and blended with the polemics of politics, which emerged from recorded historical facts. So on the one hand, we have the polemics of politics that emerge from historical records, and on the other hand, we have the polemics of religion, which are foregrounded in the moralities. And the two are blended in the English history play, and what emerges is an essentially political discourse that is not entirely independent of moral questions. So that, for us, is the English history play of the Tudor period. A kind of play where we have essentially political discourses, which, however, are not entirely independent of moral questions. Irving Ribner points out that the new, and he was a 20th century critic, like Tilliard, a critic from the early part of the 20th century, and he points out that the new political doctrines of the Renaissance, such as those of Machiavelli, had connections with the religious doctrines that the morality play had served. And Machiavelli's own attempt in his Prince to isolate politics from moral issues was naive and immature. The two could not be totally kept apart. And Shakespeare, in plays such as Richard III, makes the concern with moral questions visible, even as he incorporates aspects of Machiavellian doctrines. And Richard III is a character who is indeed Machiavellian, perhaps more so than Macbeth, with whom he is sometimes compared. But such comparisons will always tell us that Richard III is the greater and the less ambiguous villain. Now, just to illustrate how questions of morality are blended with questions of politics and questions of trying to get the crown of England, I'll read for you a short passage, a short section from what is actually a long speech, a long soliloquy. It's from Henry VI, Part 3, Act 3, Scene 2. And the speaker is the Duke of Gloucester, who, in the next play that Shakespeare would write, Richard III, becomes king, and when he becomes king, he is called Richard III. But Richard III, in the play called Richard III, begins as the Duke of Gloucester. In fact, the play Richard III begins with a soliloquy by the Duke of Gloucester. That's the speech prefix. But once he becomes king, the speech prefix changes to Richard III. But this is an earlier play. This is the play that Shakespeare wrote immediately before Richard III. I'll talk about the open-endedness and the interconnectivity of the history plays later. And here, Gloucester is speaking a soliloquy. Note, there are several allusions here. But if you ignore the allusions and try to understand the spirit of the speech, you will realize that he's talking of immoral ways, so religion and morality coming, immoral ways to get at the crown, which is a political goal. Listen to this. Why, I can smile and murder whiles I smile, and cry content to that which grieves my heart, and wet my cheeks with artificial tears, and frame my face to all occasions. I'll drown more sailors than the mermaid shell, I'll slay more gazers than the basilisk, I'll play the orator as well as Nestor, deceive more slyly than Ulysses could, and like a Sinon take another Troy. I can add colors to the chameleon, change shapes with Proteus for advantages, and set the murderous Machiavel to school. Can I do this and cannot get a crown? Note the kind of confidence with which he speaks, and he's actually talking of getting the crown, but in order to do that, he must commit murders. Now, of course, there are so many plays and so many stories from the past and so many incidents in history where murders have been committed to get at the crown or to rise to power. But what Shakespeare is doing is that within the history play, the genre of the history play, he is blending the two in a way that is at once visible, that at once makes visible this sort of inseparability of politics from issues of morality. Now, in the 16th century, religion in England was closely related to political matters. Think of the Reformation and the bloody civil wars, which were perhaps necessary. At least Henry VIII thought so in the 1530s to uh, bring in Protestantism as the major religion and bring into effect what we today look back upon as the Reformation. And it is hardly surprising that religious and moral doctrines should therefore be accommodated into plays that choose history for their subject, and plays that today we call the history play. The history play has never been very easy to define, unlike tragedy and comedy. And Shakespeare's earliest editors, Hemming and Condell, obviously held that the history plays constituted a genre. The history plays are sometimes called simply the histories. And Hemming and Condell, the editors of the first folio of 1623, obviously supposed that Shakespeare's histories constituted a genre different from the tragedies and the comedies. And this explains their grouping of his plays in the page of the table of contents into histories, tragedies, and comedies. Now, this is the page of the table of contents, and it says at the top, a catalogue of the several comedies, histories, and tragedies contained in this volume. First, we have the comedies, and then the histories, and then the tragedies. Now, the question that we must ask ourselves is, why did Hemming and Condell make this sort of classification? Now, Hemming and Condell must have recognized in the three parts of Henry VI, which were perhaps the earliest plays that Shakespeare wrote, and in Richard III, and then again in Richard II, certain characteristics which compelled these two editors to view these plays as different from tragedies. But at the same time, they must have recognized the presence of such characteristics in the three Roman histories as well: Julius Caesar, Antony and Cleopatra, and Coriolanus. Similarly, the two parts of Henry IV and Henry V are seen as histories, though in these plays there is something of the conventional appeal of comedy. You remember the character of Falstaff in the two parts of Henry IV. Henry IV, part two, although it ends with the death of Henry IV, it also at the same time ends with the rise to power of Henry V. Prince Hal becomes Henry V, and there is a tragic strain when he rejects Falstaff, his companion of his wayward and youthful days. And A.C. Bradley has an essay on this rejection of Falstaff. But the play has a happy ending because it shows a very capable young man rise to the throne. And Henry V ends not only with England's victory over France in the Battle of Agincourt, but also with the young king's marriage to the French princess Catherine. So both these plays are given, or they give the audience something of the conventional appeal of comedy. So far as the Roman histories are concerned, they were grouped with the tragedies by Hemming and Condell, possibly because they did not deal with English history. I'll come to this in due course. So why did Hemming and Condell classify the 10 plays dealing with England's past as histories, in spite of the definite presence in them of either tragic or comic elements? And for an answer to that, we need to seek definitions of the genre that we call the history play. And we need to know, for example, what a history play was in the understanding of Hemming and Condell and of the Elizabethans and the Jacobeans. Now, these were the 10 history plays that Shakespeare wrote. There was King John, and then there were the two tetralogies. The second tetralogy was a group of plays that dealt with earlier events. Now, I have arranged the plays on this slide in the order of incidents in history. But if you look at the order of composition, the first tetralogy was composed earlier, and hence it's called the first tetralogy, a group of 4 related plays, the 3 parts of Henry VI, followed by Richard III, about which I've already spoken. And perhaps seeing the success of his efforts, Shakespeare decided to go back to older events of history. And therefore, once he had written the first tetralogy, he wrote the second tetralogy, which deal with earlier events, events that preceded those that are dramatized in the first tetralogy. So the order of the chronological order of actual historical events are the reverse of the chronological order of Shakespeare's composition of these plays in the two tetralogies. And so far as the incidents go, Richard II deals with the earliest incidents, and Richard III with the most recent. And there was Henry VIII, which was written much later. This was written around the time that Shakespeare was writing the romances towards the end of his career. King John and Henry VIII are plays of a slightly different kind. And the plays in the two tetralogies, sometimes together, the two tetralogies are called one massive octology, and they are sometimes viewed separately. And the 8 plays here are, as I said, interconnected and open-ended. The division of Shakespeare's plays by Hemming and Condell into histories, tragedies, and comedies suggests their disagreement with the titles of the plays in the earlier quarto editions. And the quarters had identified Richard III and Richard II as tragedies, and the titles of these plays were The Tragedy of Richard II and The Tragedy of Richard III. Henry IV and The Taming of the Shrew both contain the term history in their titles, while Hamlet in the quarto editions is called a tragical history. Now, Henry V and King Lear in the quarters were seen as chronicle histories, and the complete titles of these plays in the quarters were The Chronicle History of Henry V and The True Chronicle History of the Life and Death of King Lear and his 3 daughters. The titles of the plays in the quarto editions have therefore provided certain indications of the dramatic genres of the individual plays, but the dramatic genres, as indicated by the titles of the quarto texts, were by and large disregarded by Hemming and Condell. And in the first folio, The Taming of the Shrew, Hamlet, and King Lear are not histories. The grouping of the plays into histories, comedies, and tragedies in the first folio is the product, therefore, of the independent thinking of Hemming and Condell. And these original editors did not make this division, mind you, into the 3 dramatic kinds on the basis of the sources either. The major source for some of the plays classified by them as tragedies is history, recorded history, which is what the source also is for the history plays, though the source could not have been a basis for the division into the 3 different dramatic kinds. Holinshed and the medieval historian Geoffrey of Monmouth are important sources not only for Shakespeare's histories, but also for King Lear and Cymbeline and Macbeth, which Hemming and Condell had grouped with the tragedies. Tilliard says that Macbeth is not only the last of the great tragedies, but also the epilogue of the histories. And Tilliard does not deny Macbeth's claim to being an authentic tragedy, but seems to believe that it is closer to the histories than the other tragedies are, because, as he says, it treats the body politics differently from the other tragedies, and Scotland is a more organic part of the play than Denmark is of Hamlet, and Venice of Othello, and even Rome of Coriolanus. Now, although the quarters called Richard II and Richard III tragedies, as I've pointed out to you, the associations of Macbeth with tragedy are certainly stronger. In Macbeth, the tragedy is largely personal, unlike in Richard II and Richard III, and we can easily recognize the conflict in Macbeth, the conflict between his virtuous understanding and his evil and corrupt designs. And his inner struggles are so strong and so overwhelming and so visible to the audience that they pale the political theme into relative insignificance. But Tilliard remarks that the political theme is the instrument through which providence works. And Tilliard, interestingly, has a separate chapter on Macbeth in his book called Shakespeare's History Plays. Now, Coleridge thought that the history play was that which familiarized the people of a nation with the great names of their past. And he also saw the history play as a kind of bridge that connected the epic poem and the drama. It was a transitional link, he said. And indeed, Shakespeare's English history plays in the two tetralogies taken together do form an epic structure. And I would choose to use the term epic octology for that structure. Now, these 8 connected plays bear shades of the epic, with England as hero, but strictly speaking, Shakespeare's English histories are dramas and not epic poems. Coleridge saw the Elizabethan history play as trying to emerge out of the tradition of the true epic poem and standing on the threshold of drama. It may be argued that Coleridge did not see the history play as an independent genre in itself, and probably only saw it as a transitional link between the epic poem and drama. And he seems to have been of the view that genuine drama could be divided only into tragedies and comedies, and that the history plays, which did incorporate tragic and comic scenes, were merely Shakespeare's stepping stones to his more celebrated achievements in the genres of tragedy and comedy. Coleridge probably also saw the 8 plays in the two tetralogies as together bearing shades of the epic without altogether being epic, and distinguished them from Shakespeare's mature comedies and tragedies, which he saw as true dramas. In a history play, the history forms the plot. The plot is historical. And this is what happens also in Shakespeare's history plays. And while pointing out the difference between history plays and other dramatic forms, Coleridge says, the distinction does not depend on the mere quantity of historical events in the play compared with the fictions. For there is as much history in Macbeth as in Richard. And he could be possibly talking both about Richard II and Richard III. But in the relation of the history to the plot, it is, Coleridge says, in the relation of the history to the plot, how the relation is worked out. It is in that the difference between a history play and other kinds of drama, particularly tragedy, lies. In the purely historical plays, the history forms the plot. In the mixed, it directs it. In the rest, as in Macbeth, Hamlet, Cymbeline, Lear, it subserves it. So, in Macbeth and Hamlet and Cymbeline and King Lear, Coleridge says history subserves the plot. It's subservient to the plot. So, on the one hand, we have the purely historical plays. On the other hand, we have the tragedies, and perhaps a few comedies as well, which are not named in this quoted passage from Coleridge. And there is the mixed kind of drama, possibly a play like Christopher Marlowe's Edward II, which is partly tragedy if you consider young Mortimer's part in it, and partly historical if you consider Edward's part in it. And the full title of that play gestures towards such a division. It talks about the life and death of Edward and the tragical fall of proud Mortimer. Coleridge also recognized the existence of various types of history plays. And by mixed drama, he perhaps meant a play like Edward II, but he could also have meant plays such as the two parts of Henry IV, where there are, as I said some time ago, strong strains of comedy. Coleridge, while recognizing the variety within history plays, offered the following definition of the history play. In order that a drama may be properly historical, it is necessary that it should be the history of the people to whom it is addressed. And so this partly explains the division made by Hemming and Condell. The Roman plays were not considered histories because they did not deal with English history. They were not the history of the people to whom they were addressed. And the plays were addressed, if you think of Shakespeare and the audience that he wrote for, they were addressed to English people. It, that is, historical plays or a historical play, infuses a principle of life and organization into the naked facts and makes them all the framework of an animated whole. That's Coleridge trying to work out a definition of the history play. It's hardly surprising that Coleridge should have arrived at such a definition of a true history play, since one outstanding feature of those plays, as I've just told you, that Hemming and Condell call Shakespeare's histories, and which distinguishes these plays from the playwright's other plays, is that these plays deal with the people to whom they are addressed. And that might have been the feature that might have prompted even Hemming and Condell in the first place to group them separately. But Irving Ribner, the 20th century critic I mentioned a little while ago, says that this is an absurd ground for making generic distinctions. Well, perhaps it is. Now, Hemming and Condell, remember, were no theorists of genre. Their classification might have intended to facilitate an easy and immediate recognition of these plays as dealing with English history of the recent past. So, what about Shakespeare's Roman plays? Well, they did not deal with English history, and certainly not with English history of the recent past. Now, August Wilhelm Schlegel, in his Lectures on Dramatic Art and Literature in 1900, said that Shakespeare's English history plays taken together offer us examples of the political course of the world, not just of England, but of the world, applicable to all times. And Schlegel suggests that Shakespeare in his history plays conforms to the law of the universal, and that the appeal of these plays is for all time and to humanity everywhere, and it is not confined within the boundaries of space and time. Schelling, in his book of 1902 called The English Chronicle Play, suggests that the English history plays, and he's not making a difference here between the chronicle play and the history play, and he suggests that the English history play has closer ties with historical literature, that is, with the writing of history itself, than with dramatic genres. In saying this, he anticipates H.B. Charlton's contention that the English history play was a reply to the clamorous demand from a patriotic group of Englishmen for a cinematographic depiction of England's past. Of course, those Englishmen in Shakespeare's time couldn't have known the word cinematographic, but Charlton was writing in the 20th century, and so applied that adjective to the kind of depiction of England's past which he thought the English audiences of Shakespeare's time wanted. And he goes on to say that the history play was also a reply to the wave of exuberant national sentiment in England at that time, that of course followed the English victory over the Spanish Armada. But such reasoning seems strange when we consider that, with the probable exceptions of Henry V and Henry VIII, all the other history plays dramatize weak governance and imperfect kingship, and the disastrous consequences of weak governance and imperfect kingship. J.A.R. Marriott wrote a book in 1918 called English History in Shakespeare, and considered the English history plays of Shakespeare as political plays, and tried to examine what was said in them on politics and on the science of government and on the art of statesmanship. However, Marriott cautions us that Shakespeare was first and foremost a playwright. He was an artist who created characters and created their natures and put words into their mouths and wrote dialogues. And that is why the plays are dramatic. Marriott argues that Shakespeare was only incidentally a philosopher, politician, or historian, and so we should not identify Shakespeare's views on politics and on government with those of the characters in the history plays. And the ideas of government and kingship that emerge from these plays do not necessarily conform to Shakespeare's own. H.B. Charlton, in his lecture called Shakespeare, Politics and Politicians in 1929, said that it was Shakespeare alone who wrote the history play proper, while others merely wrote dramas on historical themes. What he possibly meant was that Shakespeare alone wrote history plays which had a dominant ideology. Now, Shakespeare's history plays deal with English history, but almost all plays on historical subjects, says Charlton, are tragedies. And he offers us the examples of Richard III and Richard II, where the theme is the ruin of the kings. But the important thing, as the important thing is that the ruins of Richard III and Richard II are brought about through their kingship. And that this is so indicates that kingship merely indicates that history is the accidental form and tragedy the essential substance of these plays. So what Charlton is saying is that these plays are essentially tragedies, and he joins the bandwagon, so to speak, of critics trying to debate whether these plays are tragedies and comedies with a sprinkling of history in them, or whether they belong to an independent genre called the history play, as Hemming and Condell suggested in 1623 in the table of contents in the first folio. So what Charlton is saying is that the fact that the ruins of kings like Richard III and Richard II is brought about through their kingship. Richard II's weak kingship and Richard III's villainy merely indicates that history is the accidental form and tragedy the essential substance of these plays. However, the fact that in these plays the ruin of the kings is brought about through their kingship is not the only thing that distinguishes them from plays like Macbeth or King Lear. There are so many other things about Richard II and Richard III which establish them as, in my opinion, belonging to an independent genre, which we need to think of as the history play. Besides, the argument that the history play was merely an accidental form, something which Charlton suggests, carries the disturbing suggestion that Shakespeare's intention was to write tragedies and never to write histories. Differentiating between chronicle plays and history plays, Charlton says that the early chronicle plays responded to the wave of exuberant national sentiment which demanded visible reminders on stage as spectacle. But of what? Of English history. Drama ceased to be true drama, therefore, and became, as Charlton thinks, more of a spectacle, staging scenes from the chronicles and thereby catering more to a political than to an artistic or aesthetic demand. The chronicle plays had an essentially undramatic structure. The dramatists freely inserted comic or tragic scenes, essentially dramatic in nature, these scenes, as episodes in the spectacle. So while the entire structure was undramatic, certain dramatic, tragic, or comic scenes were freely thrown in at random to serve as episodes in the whole undramatic spectacle or pageants from history. And these form minor plays by themselves within the massive and undramatic panorama of the chronicle plays. And Charlton offers us the example of the Cade incidents and the Talbot episode from the three parts of Henry VI, and says that those plays lack dramatic form. According to Charlton, the three parts of Henry VI are chronicle plays rather than true history plays. And according to him, there is no sustained or dominant dramatic interest in these plays that would continue to hold the audience in suspense. Charlton takes the two parts of Henry IV and Henry V, which was written after the second part of Henry IV, to be the most fully developed history plays by Shakespeare. And incidentally, these plays of the second tetralogy, along with Richard II, are together sometimes called the Henriade. Now, without being chronicle pageants, they are still neither tragedies nor comedies, though they come closer to comedy than to other recognized types, which is a point that I too had made a little while ago. But Charlton calls these plays history plays, and indeed the most fully developed history plays of Shakespeare, but adds that a better name would be political plays because in them the prevailing dramatic interest centers around the nation's fate. And Charlton believes that the history play in Shakespeare's England appeared on the Elizabethan stage as a theatrical form by pure chance. Of course, he's talking of the political situation and the zeal and enthusiasm, the patriotic fervor caused by the English naval fleet's victory over the Spanish naval fleet called the Armada in 1588. And according to Charlton, the history play was neither pure tragedy nor pure comedy, but it focused primarily on eternal life as tragedies do. It did not, it did not, I beg your pardon, it did not focus on eternal life as tragedies do. And neither did it focus on private, domestic, or social life as the comedies do. So it was neither pure tragedy nor comedy. Tragedies focus on eternal life. The history plays do not do that. Comedies focus on private and domestic and social life, and the history plays do not do that either. And Charlton distinguishes the history play from tragedy and comedy by saying that tragedy and comedy concern the eternal, that's tragedy, or the ephemeral, that's comedy, fate of individual men. Of course, if it's a comedy, it could concern the fate of groups of men in a society as well. The history play does not concern individual human beings. It concerns communities of men, and primarily nations. And Charlton goes on to recognize the real hero of Shakespeare's history plays as England, and not the individual kings in the individual plays. And this recalls the idea of Shakespeare's history plays in the two tetralogies forming one huge octology with an epic structure, with England as some sort of epic hero. W.B. Yeats, in Ideas of Good and Evil, chooses not to see Shakespeare's English history plays as individual plays, but as one single long play. He is more concerned with the overriding impression that the sequence offers. Not all the 10 plays, but the plays in the two tetralogies, the 8 plays in the two tetralogies. And to Yeats, there seems to be an unearthly, superhuman, and almost mythological force passing through the sequence and dictating England's history, and the nobles in the plays seem to remind Yeats of the ancient heroes of the Attic stage. And Yeats says that Shakespeare's history plays, I'm quoting Yeats here, are but one play. And the history plays have, when played one after another, something extravagant and superhuman, something almost mythological. These nobles, with their indifference to death and their immense energy, seem at times no nearer the common stature of men than do the gods and the heroes of Greek plays. So what he's pointing out is that these nobles that we find in the history plays, the noblemen, the dukes and earls and kings and queens, they are not people of the common sort. They are closer to the gods and the heroes of the classical Greek plays. Lily B. Campbell, in her book Shakespeare's Histories, Mirrors of Elizabethan Policy, written in 1947, reacts to Marriott's statements. What did Marriott say? I quoted Marriott a little while ago. Marriott had said that Shakespeare was first and foremost an artist, and only incidentally was he a philosopher and a politician. And therefore, we should not think of the political thoughts in the plays, in the history plays, as being Shakespeare's political thoughts. Now, Campbell reacts to Marriott's statements by saying that the drama was Shakespeare's medium of expression. And through this medium, he might have said what some other person might say of philosophy or political theory in a treatise. Just as a treatise would be that person's medium of expression, the history play was Shakespeare's chosen medium for expressing his moral and political philosophy. This, of course, continues to be debatable, but we would rather suppose that Marriott is more on the right track than Campbell is. And Campbell says also that the circular movement of the Wheel of Fortune was carried out in the English history plays in accordance with the demands of divine justice. And so he's saying something close to the idea of Christian historiography, which uh, suggested that the movement of history, the movement of the Wheel of Fortune, uh, had something to do with divine wish. And so it vindicated, in the case of recent English history, the coming to power of the Tudors. The cycles of history, Campbell says, are mapped out in moral terms as recurring patterns of sin and punishment. So he, of course, is also subscribing to this idea that in the history plays there is a blending of the moral and the political. There's also a blending of the religious and the secular. And the idea of the children suffering and paying for the sins of the fathers for long has been one way of interpreting Shakespeare's English histories, where we find that the next king in the line has to suffer for what father had done. It was customary among writers and commentators of the English Renaissance to see history, and not just the ones who wrote the history plays, but other writers of history, commentators on history during the English Renaissance, also generally saw history as illustrating a moral pattern. And among such writers were Walter Raleigh, who wrote the history of the world between 1603 and 1616, Richard Grafton, whose works were published between 1562 and 1571, and Richard Crompton, who wrote a short declaration of the end of traitors in 1587. James Sweeney, in his introduction to his book, The Player King, a theme of Shakespeare's histories, published in 1968, talks about the generic possibilities of the history plays and says that the history plays are works of an indeterminate literary kind, capable of extension towards either the comic or the tragic. As such, they provided a medium in which Shakespeare's rapidly developing powers as a poet could be exercised by ranging over an unrestricted field of events. All right, so what have we here? Histories, tragedies, and comedies. The histories differ from the comedies and tragedies in the way they apprehend time. Their beginnings and endings of the history plays, that is, suggest a perception of time as a continuum of events whose origin and closure cannot be fixed or determined. Tragedies, on the other hand, depict time as linear, irreversible, and extremely short. Renaissance tragedies move relentlessly towards death, and death is an end that is perceived as final for the individual, for the protagonist, and for the other characters who die. Comic time is perceived differently, but even that has a distinct closure. Comedies do not see death as final. On the contrary, they welcome a new phase of life. Comedies welcome a new phase of life by ending in ending with the suggestion of the possibility of multiple marriages. So they welcome a new phase of life rather than push life towards death, which in tragedy is seen as the absolute end. History plays, however, dramatize past events, the beginning and closure of which is impossible to locate. The very dramatization of past events, where the emphasis is on the events themselves and on their significance, and not so much on the individual characters whose actions determine the course of historical time, requires that the playwright look both before and after. And if you look back, you'll find that time or the past stretches back towards infinity. And if you look towards the future too stretches towards infinity. Shakespeare's first history play, the first part of Henry VI, for example, begins with the funeral procession of the dead Henry V, his father, who died young, soon after he had defeated France in the Battle of Agincourt and married Catherine, the French princess, which of course is dramatized in Henry V, which is a play that Shakespeare wrote much later as one of the plays in the second tetralogy. Now, this first play, the first history play that Shakespeare wrote, the first part of Henry VI, begins with the funeral procession of the dead Henry V and ends with the projected marriage of Henry VI to Margaret. Henry V's victory over France in Henry V, the play, are qualified by the epilogue's speech at the end of Henry V, where the epilogue tells us that this great king, Henry V, died young and left his kingdom and the French territory that he had conquered to his very young son, Henry VI, who was crowned when still an infant and who was a weakling who lost France and made his England bleed. I'm quoting the text. Henry VI failed, as we shall find out from the three parts of Henry VI, to avert civil war. Henry VI ruled in the middle of the 15th century, and his reign had already been dramatized in the first tetralogy when Shakespeare was writing Henry V. And the epilogue to Henry V simultaneously looks forward to historical time when it speaks of the child who would become the next king, and backward to an earlier series of plays, the first tetralogy, and particularly the Henry VI trilogy within the first tetralogy. The other play, of course, was Richard III. And the Henry VI trilogy, which had already dramatized the reign of Henry VI. So the audiences who had seen the three parts of Henry VI on the stage would be knowing what had happened after Henry V was dead when they were seeing Henry V for the first time. And Henry V was written in 1599 and was possibly the first play to be staged at the Globe Theatre. The history plays are open-ended, and so also are Shakespeare's history plays. Richard II ends with the new Henry IV's projected crusade to the Holy Land to do penance for his part in the murder of Richard II. And the next play, which is the first part of Henry IV, begins with Henry IV expressing a strong desire to undertake the crusade which he had talked about at the end of the previous play. So there's a connection then between the end of Richard II and the beginning of the next play, the first part of Henry IV, which shows that the play called Richard II is open-ended. The first part of Henry IV leads automatically on to the second part of Henry IV, and so on. And that leads on, again, very naturally, through that kind of open-endedness to Henry V. The third part of Henry VI, from which I read out the Duke of Gloucester's speech, a portion of it, towards the beginning of this presentation. The third part of Henry VI, in its closing scenes, shows Richard of Gloucester, the Duke of Gloucester, revealing his Machiavellian intents. And didn't he say, "I'll send the old Machiavel to school," suggesting that he would go one up on Machiavelli. And ends, the third part of Henry VI ends with Richard's brother, the new King Edward, looking forward to a period of lasting joy. And Richard III, which is the next play in the first tetralogy, and the last play in the tetralogy as well, begins with Richard speaking a soliloquy, referring ironically to the happy period of Edward's reign. And he begins with the words, "Now is the winter of our discontent made glorious summer by this son of York." Budding on son. The son of York is, of course, his brother, King Edward. But he very quickly spells out those wicked designs that he had already stated towards the end of the third part of Henry VI. And therefore, the opening lines are only ironical, and he desires to kill his brother and get to the throne. And even at the close of Richard III, we begin to look forward to the reign of Henry VII, who was the first Tudor king. Now, the close of Richard III is interesting. It was called Tragedy in the quarto editions. Um, Hemming and Condell grouped the play with the histories, Richard III. But it ends with the death of a king, Richard III. Now, if it ends with the death of a king, can it be a matter for rejoicing? Normally, it wouldn't, even if it were a history play. Richard II ends with Richard's death. The second part of Henry the Fourth ends with Henry the Fourth's death and the rise to the throne of his son. And the third part of Henry VI ends with Henry VI's death and the rise to the throne of King Edward. But then, although we understand that there is going to be a period of prosperity to follow, we cannot really celebrate deaths, can we? But the close of Richard III is interesting because Richard III's death put an end to the Wars of the Roses permanently and put an end also to the Plantagenet dynasty. And with the coming to power of Richmond, who became Henry VII, the Tudor dynasty was established. Henry VII, he came to be called, but he was Richmond when he defeated Richard III in the famous battle at Bosworth Field in 1485, which is sometimes, for the sake of convenience, taken to be the starting point, therefore, of the Renaissance in England. Now, why would English audiences in Shakespeare's time celebrate the death of a king towards the end of the play? Precisely because Henry VII, who became king towards the end of that play, was the grandfather of the present queen, Elizabeth I. And so what the play shows towards the end is more in tune with comedy, in the sense that it has a happy ending. And it establishes the dynasty of which Shakespeare's audiences were a part or were living in. And the Tudor dynasty, therefore, is something, or the coming to power, the coming into being of the Tudor dynasty is something which audiences would celebrate when they would find Richard III being killed towards the end of that play. Now, history plays focus on historical events that flow endlessly, therefore, through the infinitude of historical time. These plays do not, I assert, focus on the finite lives of individual human beings within the vast infinity of time. Campbell says that the distinction between tragedies and history plays lies in the fact that tragedy is concerned with the doings of men, which in philosophy are discussed under ethics. So the deeds of men in tragedy would, in philosophy, be discussed under ethics, and history plays are concerned with deeds of men, which in philosophy would be discussed under politics. Campbell traces the dual concept of ethics and politics back to the writings of Aristotle, the very titles of whose works Aristotle wrote a book called Politics, another called Nicomachean Ethics. And the titles of Aristotle's works, therefore, had already made familiar the division of philosophy into ethics and politics. And this is the point that Campbell is making. And Campbell offers us from the English Renaissance itself the example of Spenser's Fairy Queen, which was a Tudor epic organized to please and flatter Elizabeth I. And it was organized on the basis of this dual concept of philosophy branching off into ethics and politics. John Wilders, in a book called The Lost Garden, a view of Shakespeare's English and Roman history plays, published in 1978, disagrees with Campbell, who sees tragedies and histories as belonging to the realms of private and political lives, respectively. That was one of the things that Campbell had said in her book. Tragedies belong to the realm of political lives, private lives, and histories to the realm of political lives. Now, Wilders, in his book The Lost Garden, offers such examples as Prince Hal and Hotspur from the two parts of Henry IV, and also Coriolanus, Prince Hal and Hotspur um, uh, are characters whose private lives the audience can pry into, particularly Prince Hal and um, his misadventures at the inn and on the highway with Falstaff and the other rather seedy inmates of the inn. And there is Coriolanus, and we talk about his relationship with his mother. And then in Julius Caesar, there is a private conversation between Brutus and Cassius, uh, who quarrel because Brutus feels that Cassius is like a hot friend who is cooling, but Cassius asserts that Brutus is misunderstanding him. And this is a very private moment, a discourse on friendship and loyalty. And this is from the Roman histories, while Prince Hal and Hotspur are from the English histories. And Wilders, citing these examples, says that the history plays show the characters as much in private and domestic situations as in public official roles. And Wilders further claims that Shakespeare himself did not distinguish between the personal and political motives of his characters, and these to him were so closely interwoven as to be inseparable. Of course, I would like to argue, though I wouldn't really expand that argument here in today's presentation, that sometimes in the tragedies it is precisely this inability of the characters to distinguish the private from the public that proves to be a major cause of their undoing. Take, for example, the opening scene of King Lear. The love test that Lear carries out would have been better carried out within the domestic sphere of Lear's house, where the father could interact with daughters, rather than in the courtroom, where it's more like a king interacting with courtiers. And what's going on is a ritual that is almost rudely broken by Cordelia. But that's not really the subject of today's discussion. Now, both tragedies and history plays take their subjects from history. It's uncertain whether Shakespeare was actually aware of a long, he could have been, but we don't know for sure, whether he was actually aware of an old literary tradition according to which writers of tragedy took their material from history and those of comedy from either fiction or from their own imagination. And Shakespeare's own tragedies, with the possible exceptions of Romeo and Juliet and Othello, are based on historical matter. This principle, John Wilders says, originated in a misunderstanding of a portion of the ninth book of Aristotle's Poetics, and was given currency in the essay De Commedia by the 4th century classical scholar Evanthius. And the Elizabethans, however, wrongly credited Donatus with the authorship of the essay. They didn't know that it was Evanthius. Later research, of course, has uncovered the truth. Now, Renaissance Italian literary theorists, such as Scaliger and Castelvetro, have repeated the idea that tragedies took their material from history and comedies from either fiction or from the imagination. And this literary principle places history plays, therefore, closer to tragedies than to comedies. However, Shakespeare's intermingling of genres and modes, which can be the subject of a separate presentation altogether, his intermingling of genres and modes, and for this distinction between genres and modes, I'll suggest going through Alistair Fowler's book. It's a remarkable book, Kinds of Literature. And Shakespeare's intermingling of genres and modes in the history plays invoke and employ the comic mode as well. Though, as I was saying, the literary principle that I spoke about places history plays closer to tragedies than to comedies. But Shakespeare intermingles genres and modes in the history play in a way that invokes and employs the comic mode to such an extent that critics like Ethel and Rositia and Watson and Halverson and MacLaughlin and a host of others have commented extensively on it. And in fact, Falstaff in the two parts of Henry IV, and particularly in the first part of Henry IV, remains not only one of Shakespeare's greatest comic creations, but one of the greatest comic creations in world literature. And Falstaff is not a character in any of the comedies in the table of contents in the first folio. He is a character in these two history plays. Of course, yes, it's wrong to say that he's not a character in any of the comedies because on popular demand he was brought back, yes, in The Merry Wives of Windsor. So he features there, but we don't really remember Falstaff much for what he does in The Merry Wives of Windsor. We remember him for the two parts of Henry IV. Now, my concluding observations on what to me is a fascinating subject. Now, the history play is a subject which is not very often taught in colleges and universities, and neither is it very frequently discussed in the academia. But it's quite fascinating that Shakespeare was so actively engaged in writing a kind of drama which originated not in ancient Greece or Rome, but in his own time in England. The history play, as we have seen, is a kind of play that was born in Shakespeare's England and is the most English of all kinds of drama. And it's extremely difficult and perhaps even impossible to define the history play. A history play deals with events from actual history. I'm only summing up now things that I've already said. Number two, a history play accommodates and subsequently intermingles several modes and genres. Third, a history play may either be formless and episodic, though I would make a distinction between the chronicle play and the history play and would think of the chronicle play as being formless and episodic, and of the history play as being a well-knit dramatic structure. Fourth, a history play generally has an open beginning and an open ending, which suggests that history is a continuum of events. Fifth, a history play emphasizes not so much the private lives and temperaments of individuals, particularly rulers, as the influence of those lives and temperaments on the affairs of the nation. Sixth, a history play amalgamates an essentially political discourse with moral doctrines and marginalizes other issues such as sexual relations and love interests. Now, such a definition is hardly sufficient, as you will understand, to accommodate all the possibilities of a history play. But we have to seek definitions, and the kind of definition with which I have concluded may facilitate certain distinctions on the basis of genre between the history play and other kinds of plays written either by Shakespeare or by anyone else. Thank you very much for having patiently listened to this discussion on not only the rise of the history play, but the understanding of history and the understanding of the history play in Shakespeare's England. Thank you very much. Thank you.
As we have expected, this has been a fascinating talk. Dr. Sengupta has shed light on an area which is relatively unexplored, as he has mentioned, relatively less included in the syllabi of different universities. History plays always make a fascinating read, and in the deliberations made by Dr. Sengupta, we are sure that many of you would have found foods for thought, and some of you must have also found questions to ask. We have run over time a little bit, But we can take a few questions, and I would request now Professor Tanmoy Kundu to please make the questions that I believe have come on the YouTube comment section to make these questions visible to our speaker so that he can answer them. Tanmoy?
Swagata,
Mm-hmm.
actually Subhajit is not here in this room,
Shojit has left the room.
but disconnected I think.
Oh, so could you just call him and check whether he would like to get back? Because here a storm is brewing. I do not know with Shojita whether, um, yeah, can you hear me? Or have I myself been got disconnected? No, so I believe I am on it. Tanmay, if you can hear me, are you calling Dr. Sengupta? Okay, let me also stop cam.
Hello.
Oh yeah, you are visible and audible both. We
Yeah,
are.
Shoigot, I was temporarily disconnected. I'm sorry about that.
No, no, never mind. We can't do anything about these things. You know, technology always gets, or not always, sometimes gets better of us. I'm waiting for actually Tonmoy because if he joins, then he would be able to. Yeah, Tonmoy is joining.
Yes.
So, Tonmoy,
Okay. Yes. I'm making it visible to the screen and
oh,
certain
Amrita
with.
is asking question. Okay. Shubhita, can you see the question?
Yes, so there's a question from Amrit Shen.
Right, right.
How do you see a transition in the staging of the histories in the 18th century? Well, Amrit, I'm not very sure, but of course, I haven't really given that a thought, honestly. But the understanding of history in the 18th century would have surely much to do with it. And in the 18th century, if you think of the Elizabethan history plays and Shakespeare's history plays, they were not staged as often as the other plays by Shakespeare. Um, it's a question which I'll need to think over, Amrit, honestly, because I don't think I'll venture to say anything on that without really looking deeper into it. And maybe we can talk it over later. But I know the 18th century interests you. I wish I could have given you a more satisfactory reply than this rather summary dismissal of the subject. But I think I'll need to think about it. What I can say in reply to Amrit's question is that the English history play was never very popular on the 18th century stage. Um, that I think is the one thing that I can say with conviction at the moment. It wasn't popular on the English stage as much as other kinds of plays were. Of course, in the 18th century, in matters of staging, there were vast differences from the way things were in Shakespeare's time. The stage uh, was of an entirely different sort, as we know, and there was a lot of decor on the stage. The cyclorama and other stage properties were brought in. The stage was a lavishly ornamented set, so to speak, which was hardly the case in Shakespeare's time. I'm not sure, but this could have had the effect where and when histories were staged in the 18th century of rooting the history plays or the idea of history to a certain place and time, and thereby um, that would be confrontational with the idea of history as a continuum. But again, as I said, this is something that I need to think more deeply over. There's a question from Momita Roy. In the beginning of your presentation, you said Shakespeare's history plays are perhaps the most English. Yes. Now, I said this, and I will always say that, I trust, because the history plays originated in England. And at the time that Peel and Green and Marlowe were writing plays on English history, they were dramatizing the Chronicles. And Marlowe, of course, was adding a bit of his own ideology to the matter of the Chronicles, as indeed was Shakespeare, particularly in the plays in the second tetralogy. While they were doing this, the neighboring countries, France and Italy, were not really engaged in writing history plays. And so, even today, when we think of the history plays have since then been written elsewhere in other parts of the world, and we all know that. But unlike other kinds of drama that were prevalent in the Renaissance, tragedy and comedy, for example, and the various subgenres of tragedy and comedy, unlike them, the history play had a distinctly English origin, which may be ascribed to an English political victory and the wave of patriotism that followed that victory. And it was meant to cater to that wave of patriotism. And that precisely, to my thinking, is the ground on which Hemming and Condell had grouped the histories separately. They were plays that were addressing English audiences and readers and dealt with recent English history. There's a question from Shaista Rahman. All of Shakespeare's plays deal with the story of kings and royal life. How has the scholar classified tragedy or historical? I think I spoke about that. Now, I spoke at length, didn't I, about the difference between tragedies and histories. And also, I spoke of how tragedies, like histories, take their matter from historical facts. Now, one thing that I didn't say, of course, during the presentation, but which your question gives me an opportunity to speak briefly about, is that whenever in the soliloquies, in the histories, we are able to access the kings in their private moments, they generally don't talk about their own individual circumstances and predicaments as a Macbeth does, or a Hamlet, or an Othello does. They talk about, in their soliloquies, generally, about the general trials and tribulations of kingship. Take, for example, Richard II. In his prison in Pomfret Castle, he talks about how nerve-wracking kingship can be, how weak a king essentially is. Henry V, walking incognito among his soldiers in the tents on the eve of the Battle of Agincourt, he's in disguise. And he says that it's only ceremony that distinguishes kings from other people. And kings are essentially more vulnerable and more tempest-tossed than ordinary people. And he is envious of ordinary people who can have sound sleep at night. Henry IV, in the second part of Henry IV, muses on the troubles of kingship and has a speech on that, a soliloquy, which concludes with the oft-quoted line, "Uneasy lies the head that wears a crown." The point is that even when we access these figures from the history plays in their private moments, they're talking about kingship in a more general sort of way. Macbeth doesn't talk about kingship in a general sort of way. Neither does Claudius, for example, in Hamlet, or Hamlet himself. He never talks about the problem about being a prince, a member of the royal family. He talks about his individual problems. There's a question from Parul Shoni. In the case of transition of stage, I couldn't follow that. Can we say that comedy of manners replaced the history plays and the shift from the monarchy? No, not really. The comedy of manners, I think, was entirely different. It's more related, as you know, to the comedy of humors, though there are differences between the comedy of humors and the comedy of manners. But I don't think the history plays led in any way to the comedy of manners. And if you talk about the common man, the history plays that Shakespeare wrote, for example, have much to do with the common man as well. So many common characters, commoners as they would be called in Shakespeare's England, in the history plays. I refer to the John Cade scenes from one of the Henry VI plays, and in those scenes we have riots organized by common men, just as there is in Julius Caesar, which is one of the Roman history plays, where the common people of Rome go around breaking chairs and benches after Mark Antony has succeeded in convincing them that Brutus had done great wrong in killing Caesar. So the common man has nothing really to do with a particular kind of drama that developed later. If you look at the tragedies that Shakespeare wrote, we have common men there also, though the tragic protagonists are certainly not commoners, but we do have common men everywhere in Shakespeare. And there have been books and journal articles on commoners and common men in Renaissance drama.
Okay, Tonmoy, if I believe there are other questions, but as we have run out of time a little bit, we are going to a bit unfortunately stop here. And before I request Mondira Panda, a student of UG Semester 2, to offer the formal vote of thanks, here is a personal thank you to Shubhajit Da. This time I'm addressing him informally for this
You're
wonderful,
welcome.
wonderful talk. And it
It was a
is
pleasure. Thank you.
it's always fascinating to listen to you, whether you are talking about cricket or about Shakespeare. And this time it was no different. So without further delay, I would now like to request Mundira to please offer the formal vote of thanks.
Yes, am I audible?
You are.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. This is Mandira from UG second semester, Midnapur College Autonomous. As all good things come to an end in life, so does today's wonderful lecture. I am delighted to have been given the pleasant duty of delivering vote of thanks this time. On behalf of the Department of English and on my own behalf, I want to propose a vote of thanks to those who have directly and indirectly contributed to this lecture on the Rise of the English History Play in Age of Shakespeare, organized by our department. At the outset, I cordially thank our resource person, Dr. Subhajit Sen Gupta, Associate Professor and Head of the Department of English and Cultural Studies, University of Burdwan. We are really enlightened with your knowledge and presence, sir. We are thankful to our Honorable Principal Sir, Dr. Gopal Chandra Bera, who has inspired us to host this online lecture series. I would like to thank our Professor Tanmay Kundu sir for his enthusiastic support and initiative to make our turbulent period charming at least for 1 or 2 hours per day. A special thanks to our Professor Dr. Shoikat Sarkar sir for conducting today's lecture. Our heartfelt thanks to all the participants for their active participation from all over India. With these warm words and a kind message, we move to the end of today's session. Thank you. Thank you all.